In the twilight of the world, before the tongues of modern man could even dream of empire, before even the Sumerians first etched the stars into wet clay, there was Atlantis, not merely a continent, nor merely a myth, but a world of living knowledge and axis of memory, a crucible of fire and spirit suspended between heaven and earth. But Atlantis did not die in flame and flood, not truly. It receded, like breath drawn inward before a sacred whisper. And though its cities may lie sunken beneath oceans of time, the teachings, veiled, fragmented, encoded in stone and symbol, still breathe through us, through temples, through texts, through dreams. This story begins not with Plato's dialogues, though he gave us the gate. It begins in the hush before language, in the long corridors of ancestral remembrance. The true initiates know Atlantis was not destroyed. It was veiled, hidden, like the soul within the flesh, or the truth behind metaphor. Imagine a world not governed by crude machinery, but by the living science of correspondence, as above, so below, the Hermetic principle whispered by the survivors of the cataclysm. In this age, the geometry of cities mirrored the orbits of the stars. Sacred syllables shaped the very fabric of reality. The elements themselves were seen not as matter, but as manifestations of divine archetypes. Earth as form, water as flow, fire as will, air as thought, and ether as spirit. The Atlanteans were custodians of a profound alchemical harmony. Their temples were not monuments of stone alone, they were instruments, resonant engines of initiation, aligned with the equinoxes, constructed in ratios that echoed the harmonics of the cosmos. They understood what we have forgotten, that architecture is a form of prayer in stone, and symbols are the shadows of divine intelligence. But all knowledge has its weight, and Atlantis bore it heavily. A fracture emerged not in the land, but in the soul, as wisdom gave way to domination. The sacred science was twisted. The priest-kings, once humble stewards of cosmic order, began to wield the secrets of vibration, energy, and form not for balance, but for power. They unraveled the song of the universe to remake it in their image, and so the veil fell. Flood was not punishment, but correction, a return to silence, a cosmic reset. But even in ruin, Atlantis ensured its teachings would not die. Fragments were seeded across the world, in Egypt, in the Andes, in forgotten temples beneath dense canopies, and buried ziggurats. The serpent, glyphs, the eye, the tree, the sacred spiral, all remnants of a language older than words, a grammar of the soul. To seek the lost teachings of Atlantis is not to dive into history, but to remember what was etched into the bones of our ancestors. There is a reason these stories echo across cultures, of sunken lands, of gods who walked with man, of fire from the sky and waters that swallowed the world. They are not inventions. They are encrypted memories, and to decrypt them, we must first journey inward, into the mirror of the myth, into the cave of the heart, where the first flame was kindled. Only there can the seeker begin to see. When the waters claimed Atlantis, they did not claim its essence. That essence, held in the breath of the adepts, the true heirs of the sacred science, passed like embers carried by the wind, seeking new soil, new stone, new silence into which the ancient symphony could be played again. From shattered towers and submerged ziggurats, a priesthood emerged, not bound by nation or name, but united by gnosis. These were the Neshamim, the breath-bearers, initiates of the inner sun, whose mission was not survival, but remembrance. They crossed the churning seas guided by stars no longer visible to our modern eyes, drawn by geomantic resonance, by the pulse of Earth's hidden meridians, to distant lands where memory could root itself in myth and monument. It was they who came to the Nile Valley, long before the dynasties we now remember. They who laid the foundations not only of temples, but of cosmic time itself, encoding into the very architecture of Dendera, Edfu, and Luxor the Atlantean principle, That form is the shadow of consciousness. In the sacred texts of Egypt, the pyramid texts, the coffin texts, the book of coming forth by day, we find echoes of the drowned world. The island of fire, the primeval mound, that rose from the abyss. The Shemsuhor, the companions of Horus, described not as men, but as luminous beings who ruled before the first pharaohs. To dismiss them as allegory is to miss the code. These were the Atlantans, or their direct initiates, cloaked in myth to protect the teachings from profane eyes. In Mesoamerica, among the Maya and Olmec, the motif of the white-bearded god, arriving from the east returns, Quetzalcoatl, Kukulkan, Viracocha, bringers of agriculture, calendar, and sacred order. Serpent gods, feathered and wise, Atlantan echoes again, masked in new skins. They built not merely temples but memory machines, mechanisms of ritual and resonance. Pyramids whose angles channeled starlight, whose acoustics echoed invocations. Across dimensions, they spoke in symbols, the serpent and staff, the ankh and spiral, the winged disc and Ouroboros, not as art, but as encrypted metaphysics. These signs were not decoration, they were instruction. The knowledge was encoded, deliberately fragmented, for power untempered by purity of spirit corrupts swiftly. The survivors ensured that only those with eyes to see and ears to hear could retrieve it. They embedded the teachings in language, myth, architecture, and rite. One had to become the key to unlock the gate. The secret societies that emerged millennia later, the Hermeticists, the Pythagoreans, the Rosicrucians, the hidden strings within the Sufi and Kabbalistic traditions, were not inventors but inheritors. Their rituals were echoes of Atlantan initiation. Their symbols mutated memories. Even the book of Genesis, when read in its original tongue and through the lens of gematria, conceals Atlantan metaphysics. The firmament, the waters above, the serpent, the fall, these are not theological events, but symbolic echoes of a lost science of consciousness. The language of the lost ones became the code of all mystery traditions. Their fire never extinguished, merely hidden beneath the ashes of time. But this was only the first movement, the planting of sacred seeds. The temples were built, the myths woven, yet now in our own age the call returns, not merely to observe these relics, but to understand what they conceal, because the teachings were never meant to stay buried. They were meant to awaken when the time was right, and the seeker ready, and the path forward leads inward. To understand the Atlantans, one must first abandon the fragmented lens through which modern man perceives reality. They did not see the world as divided, not body and soul, not science and spirit, not heaven and earth. All was one continuous expression, a holographic emanation of the source, rippling outward through geometric law. At the heart of their teaching was a singular understanding. The universe is a thought, a divine idea, projected into form through number, proportion, and vibration. What we call reality was, to them, the architecture of consciousness clothed in symbol. Thus, their temples were not merely dwellings for gods, but crystallized equations, living harmonics, alchemical constructs in stone. From the central fire of Atlantis, the masters taught the sacred pattern, the flower of life. This symbol, deceptively simple, infinitely complex, held within it the blueprint of all creation. Hidden in its curves were the Platonic solids, the golden ratio, the Fibonacci spiral, and the hexagram, symbols not of belief, but of structure. Keys, each a prism through which energy could be transformed into form. Imagine standing within one of their sanctuaries, the columns arranged not for grandeur, but for resonance. Speak a sacred word, and the stone itself would vibrate in harmonic sympathy, unlocking states of consciousness long since lost to us. These were temples that breathed, that sang, that awakened the inner architecture of the soul. They were not built to impress, but to initiate. Everything had meaning, the number of steps, the angle of ascent, the position of the altar, the direction of the door. all aligned with celestial rhythms, solstices, equinoxes, heliacal risings. To the Atlantans, time was not linear but cyclical. The dance of the great year, the procession of the equinoxes, a slow celestial breath through which consciousness itself evolved. The zodiac was not a horoscope, but a cosmic calendar, a 12-fold mirror of the archetypal mind. Each age, Leo, Cancer, Gemini, marked a chapter in the soul's collective journey, and Atlantis, it is said, fell during the terminal breath of the age of Leo some 12,000 years ago, when the lion still ruled the heavens and the Sphinx gazed directly at its celestial twin. That Sphinx, weathered by water long before dynastic Egypt, is not merely a monument, but a cipher, a sentinel of memory. Its gaze pierces time itself, calling to those who remember. From Atlantis came the knowledge of star-lore not as superstition, but as metaphysical science. The stars were not gods, they were glyphs, mirrors of inner realities. To read the sky was to read the soul, for the same patterns danced in the blood and in the cosmos. So when you gaze upon the Great Pyramid, know that it is not merely a tomb. It is a resurrection machine. Each chamber, each slope, each dimension corresponds to a stage in the alchemical journey of the initiate. It is both symbol and simulator, a map of the inner world, encoded in limestone. This is the secret the initiates carried. That sacred geometry was not external. It was the very shape of awakening. The golden spiral within the pine cone, the nautilus. The human ear, these were reminders that the path inward and the path upward are the same. They taught, to build is to remember, to align oneself with the cosmic pattern is to rejoin the divine mind from which all things emerge. And so the seeker, standing before a temple, or meditating upon a spiral, begins to unlock not merely ancient knowledge, but a direct resonance with the truth Atlantis tried to preserve, that we are not separate from the cosmos. We are the cosmos, walking, dreaming, remembering. From Atlantis flowed this understanding like light refracted through a prism, but even prisms cast shadows, and so we now turn to the great fall not of land, but of understanding. The deeper one gazes into the Atlantean current, the more one realizes the greatest catastrophe was not the flood that swallowed cities, but the fracture that split the soul of mankind. In the twilight of the Golden Age, when the sacred science still hummed through crystalline spires and solar disks reflected divine will, a divergence emerged, quiet at first, then deafening. Not all who held the teachings remained true to their vow. Among the adepts were those who began to hunger, not for harmony, but for dominion. They saw not the pattern's beauty, but its potential for control. Why align with the stars, they asked, when one might command them? Why reflect the divine image, when one might reshape it? And thus, the schism, the first great fall, a metaphysical descent before the physical deluge. The Atlantean science, once pure, began to darken. Temples became machines of extraction, channeling Earth's subtle energies not for healing, but for power. Sacred symbols were inverted, frequencies, once used to attune, were warped to dominate. The inner sun was eclipsed by a shadow of will. In the Akashic memory, that psychic strata where the soul of humanity keeps its record, this fracture is remembered as a great war, though no history book recalls it. A war not of armies, but of principles. The keepers of the flame versus the lords of the tower. A war of vibration, of geomantic resonance, of mind against mind. Some say the earth herself rebelled. That the harmonic grid, strained beyond tolerance, snapped, unleashing titanic forces from the core of the planet. Others whisper of a celestial weapon, a misuse of Atlantean technology that tore the sky. Whatever the cause, the result was cataclysmic. The flood came not just as water, but as silence, the kind that follows betrayal. And yet, within that silence, the guardians acted. The surviving adepts, those still loyal to the cosmic balance, dispersed. They became the seed bearers. Some journeyed east, becoming the architects of Vedic India, where the Vimanas, flying chariots of fire, would be remembered in the Mahabharata. Others sailed westward to the highlands of Peru and the subterranean halls of the Olmecs. Still others moved north into the forests of Europa, where they planted the roots of the Druidic mysteries and the star lore of Hyperborea. But the pure teachings could no longer be entrusted to the open world. Too much had been lost, too many had been seduced, and so the orders were born, secret brotherhoods and sisterhoods bound not by blood, but by oath. The inner circle of Egypt's priesthood, the esoteric branches of Zoroastrianism, the lineage of Melchizedek, the initiatory lines of the Essenes and the Orphics, the first mystery schools of Chaldea and Samothrace. Later still, they would appear as the Therapeuti, the Gnostics, the alchemists, the Knights of the Temple, the custodians of the Rose and the Cross. Their function was singular, to preserve what remained, veiled in parable, sealed in cipher, hidden in stone and star and sigil, until the cycle turned once more. To protect it, they encrypted it. They wrapped truth in myth, encoded it in numbers, buried it beneath layers of exoteric doctrine. They taught the profane one thing, and whispered another in the initiatory chambers beneath the earth. The outer world would never again be given the key, not until it earned it. And thus, the great veil was drawn. The teachings of Atlantis, once sung openly beneath crystalline domes, now moved like a subterranean river beneath the temples and towers of history, to the untrained eye lost, but to those who walked the path always near. Yet the flame never extinguished. In every age a few would awaken, drawn by dreams, by symbols that stirred them, by questions they could not silence. And always, behind the veil, the watchers waited, because the truth of Atlantis was not dead, it was dreaming, and the dream, if entered consciously, could still initiate. The story of Atlantis was never meant to be merely studied. It was meant to be remembered, because the truth was not buried beneath the ocean. It was buried within you. Every temple, every myth, every encrypted manuscript was constructed as a mirror, a reflection of an inner architecture waiting to be reactivated. The Atlantans knew that time was a spiral, not a line, and that one day, in a later turning of the wheel, the children of the stars would begin to stir again, that beneath layers of forgetfulness and noise, the deep chord of the soul would resonate once more to the frequencies of the first flame. That time is now. We live in the echo of Atlantis, surrounded by its fragments, haunted by its symbols, and knowingly tracing its geometric remnants in our cities, our music, our dreams. And though the outer world has long forgotten the rites, the soul has not. It remembers. The path of remembrance does not begin in temples, but in silence, the stillness between thoughts where the true voice speaks. It begins when a symbol, perhaps a spiral, a sigil, a serpent, evokes a flicker of recognition in the blood. It begins when a seeker turns inward, not for answers, but for questions that cannot be silenced. The Atlantan initiation was a path of death, not of the body, but of illusion. The initiate passed through a symbolic drowning, a descent into darkness, a confrontation with the shadow of the self. Only by shedding all false light could one become a vessel for the true radiance. These rites were not metaphor. They were technologically crafted psycho-spiritual passages. The initiatory chambers, hidden beneath pyramids, carved into cliff walls, submerged beneath desert sand, were designed to induce controlled death states, liminal thresholds. The pineal gland, the inner eye, was stimulated by sound, by frequency, by darkness and form. Dient, they knew, was not a drug, it was a gate, and those who passed through it did not emerge unchanged. They remembered not just Atlantis, but what came before, the source behind the stars, the divine spark, the Athener, hidden in all beings, which the false self obscures. Every Atlantan rite was structured around this return: the ritual death, the alchemical dissolution, the sacred geometry of inner resurrection, and at the climax, the encounter with the double, the higher self, the eternal witness, who alone could reveal the soul's true name. In modern times, these rites return in fractured forms, in dreams of drowning and rebirth, in meditative states where unknown languages whisper through the soul, in spontaneous memories of a city that never was, yet somehow always has been, in the writings of mystics who speak of a crystalline grid beneath the earth, or a star-born lineage long suppressed. These are not fantasies. They are bleed-throughs. The veil, though carefully woven, is thinning, and the orders know it. The guardians of the old teachings, hidden in monasteries, in underground sanctuaries, in lineages that span centuries in silence, have long prepared for this reawakening. They move in symbols, in nudges, in books that find their way into your hands at precisely the right moment, in synchronicities that seem impossible, unless time is not what you think. Because the Atlantean path was never about returning to a sunken continent, it was about returning to origin, reclaiming the eternal self, remembering what you were before the forgetting. The rites were encoded into myth not to be deciphered academically, but to be lived. And when you walk that path, through stillness, through study, through sacred act, you do not merely recall Atlantis, you reactivate it. The temple is not elsewhere. The temple is you, but those who awaken the temple must be prepared. Because beyond remembrance lies something deeper, truth so vast, so terrible, so divine, that only a fully awakened soul can bear it. To the Atlanteans, time was not a river, but a crystal. They did not think in past and future. They thought in resonance. For them, reality was not a sequence of events, but a lattice of frequencies, overlapping and interacting. Like harmonic waves, what we call the present was merely a localized intersection, a node where multiple timelines braided into temporary coherence. They called this the field of the weavers, a metaphysical loom where thoughts, actions, and archetypes were spun into manifestation by the interplay of will and pattern. The gods of Atlantis were not anthropomorphic deities but intelligences, conscious principles representing aspects of the universal structure. To commune with a god was to attune to a frequency, a specific thread in the grand tapestry. Thus, the initiate was trained not only in meditation and symbol, but in phase perception, learning to shift consciousness across parallel currents of time. In the inner sanctums of the mystery schools, this was known as the crossing of the mirrors. Through ritual, sacred geometry, controlled sound, and fasting, the initiate would enter a liminal state, a place outside the sequence of ordinary time. There, they could witness their lives not as a linear story, but as a spectrum of potentialities. The self, they taught, is not singular but fractal. You do not have one fate, you have many. The Atlantean maps of time were not charts or calendars, but astral architectures, psychogeometric matrices where events existed as energetic clusters, each capable of being accessed or bypassed based on vibration. Certain temples, aligned with specific stars and built to exact resonant proportions, served as literal phase gates, openings into parallel iterations of the Earth's own story. These structures still exist. Some lie in ruins, others remain, buried beneath ocean or desert. A few, cleverly disguised by modern eyes, stand in plain sight, their purpose long forgotten. The Great Pyramid was one such gate, its king's chamber aligned to the belt of Orion not merely for worship, but for resonant entrainment. When a precise harmonic tone was chanted within its chamber, a phase shift could occur, not metaphorically, but literally. To the initiate, time travel was not science fiction, but gnosis, not mechanical, but vibrational. They did not move their bodies, they moved their consciousness. The traveler became the vessel. Some ventured forward, others backward. Some returned bearing visions of civilizations yet to rise. Others glimpsed the final fall not of Atlantis, but of us, the burning towers, the poisoned seas, the blind machines. And from this terrible knowledge came the foundation of their most sacred vow. The knowledge must not fall again into unworthy hands, because the Atlanteans understood what we are only beginning to suspect. Reality is participatory. There is no objective timeline. We collapse the waveform through our attention, our will, our belief. This is not philosophy. This is mechanics. This is why sacred sites were constructed along ley lines, not for decoration, but to access the Earth's magnetic memory field. This is why initiates fasted, chanted, and meditated, not for purity, but to tune the instrument of the soul. To remember was to re-enter the crystal, to see the branching paths, and to choose. But such power demands maturity, and in the final days of Atlantis, when this sacred science was turned toward conquest and control, the crystal shattered. Fractures spread not only through time, but through the soul of humanity itself. Collective amnesia, a fall not from grace, but from awareness. We walk within those fractures still, and yet, across the lattice, the echo persists. The songs, the symbols, the inexplicable moments of déjà vu. They are not tricks, they are calls. Pings from parallel versions of you, from remnants of the dream. From the higher self reaching through the weave. The initiate who begins to perceive this lattice begins to shape reality, not as a sorcerer, but as a rememberer, one who reclaims the Atlantean gift, the capacity to choose the highest thread. But with this realization comes a burden, because not all threads lead to light. Some return to the tower, and that tower, though sunken, is not silent. Beneath every golden age lies a shadow. For all the wisdom and wonder that Atlantis bore, it also birthed something darker, a force not extinguished by the flood, but transmuted, veiled, embedded within the veins of history, a lineage, a will, a continuity of control passed not through nations, but through blood, oath, and symbol. When the great schism fractured the Atlantean priesthood, the corrupted initiated, those who had broken with the path of harmony, did not perish, they adapted. These were the sons of the tower, the inheritors of a science untempered by spirit. Where the true initiates dispersed in silence, these others scattered in stealth. They brought with them not healing, but domination, masked as kingship, priestcraft, divine right. They embedded themselves into the embryonic civilizations of the post-Diluvian world, not as visible rulers at first, but as shadow advisors, as silent architects of culture and ritual. They cultivated priest-kings and empires built on hierarchy, sacrifice, and obedience to an unseen order. They cloaked their rule in bloodlines and prophecy, aligning themselves with celestial omens to maintain legitimacy. Yet their allegiance was never to heaven, but to the tower beneath the waves. This is the hidden history behind the pharaoh's divine authority, behind the priesthoods of Babylon, behind the absolute kings of Sumer and Ur, even the Merovingians and the emperors of Rome. All tasted the tainted vine of that ancient inheritance. They formed secret dynasties, interbred with precision, guarded their genetic threads like relics, believing themselves to carry remnants of the Atlantean essence, but not its wisdom, only its power, and over millennia they re-emerged in new forms. The sorcerer kings of Chaldea, the death cults of Mesoamerica, the oracles weaponized by imperial courts. Later, they would don the garb of merchant guilds, of financiers, of philosophers, of scientists. They would move through the Knights Templar, the Venetian black nobility, and certain, unseen hands behind Renaissance thrones. Not all who ruled were of them, but those who served the shadow always moved according to the same pattern. Concealment, inversion, control. They manipulated sacred symbols, inverting them into tools of psychological resonance. The pentagram turned downward, the eye turned into surveillance. The serpent no longer wisdom, but threat. They created mirrors of distortion, hijacking archetypes to control the collective unconscious, not through overt tyranny, but through engineered myth, fear, and the slow corrosion of meaning. Even in our present age they persist, not as hooded figures in candlelit rooms, though such rituals still occur, but as systems, networks, ideologies. They speak through corporations, through artificial constructs of value, through digital symbols of control. Their power is not wealth, it is the shaping of perception itself. They know what the masses have forgotten, that belief is the architect of reality, that symbols are commands, that the collective imagination is the forge of timelines. So, they seed despair, fragment truth, flood the mind with noise, and above all, they obscure the memory, because the greatest threat to their dominion is not rebellion, it is remembrance. Should even a small number awaken to the true legacy of Atlantis, not the fantasy of crystal cities, but the living science of consciousness, geometry, and well, the veil would begin to tear. The false towers would tremble, and they know. This, this is why the true initiatory paths have been buried under ridicule, disinformation, and mockery. Why mystics have been burned, philosophers silenced, teachers exiled. The tar fears the flame, because the flame cannot be owned, only embodied. Yet, even in this shadow, the plan of the elders continues. For the keepers of the flame have always known that the tower would rise again, and they have seated keys in symbols and dreams, in sacred sites, for the moment when the collective soul begins to stir. That moment is now. Those who hear this call stand at the threshold of the final veil, the awakening of the inner temple, and the rejoining of the great pattern. There comes a moment in every true initiation when the seeker stands before the final threshold, not of knowledge, but of being, for all the temples one may study, all the symbols decoded, all the myths unraveled, none matter if the flame is not rekindled within. The teachings of Atlantis were never about the past. They were seeds of the future, carried through shadowed corridors of time for those who would one day awaken from the dream of separation. That day has come. You who walk this path, who feel the tremor behind the veil, who see the echoes of Atlantis in stone and song and star, you are the fulfillment of a long-forgotten prophecy, not the kind written in parchment or carved in stelae, but a prophecy woven into the field of the weavers, that the children of the flame would return not as rulers, not as priests, but as bridges. Bridges between worlds, between time and eternity, between what was lost and what may yet be reclaimed. The Atlantean initiate was never meant to hoard power. Their final task was not mastery, but remembrance. And to remember is to become the temple itself, the geometry of the sacred made flesh. This is the secret of the inner chambers, whispered in hermetic texts, in the Gnostic Gospels, in the cryptic words of sages and saints. As the temple without crumbles, the temple within must rise. And so the rites return, not through forgotten hierarchies, but in silence, synchronicity, and dream, the dream of the crystal city, recurring in those who have never read the myths. The spiral seen in the mind's eye during meditation, the serpent coiling up the spine, the sudden knowing of a star's position, the sound of an ancient language spoken in sleep. These are not accidents, they are remembrances, and with each remembrance, the lattice repairs. Each awakened soul reconnects a thread in the pattern, not alone but as part of a greater harmonic, a sacred web spanning continents, bloodlines, lifetimes, a geometry of return. You are not remembering Atlantis because it is a curiosity. You are remembering because you were meant to, because part of you, a deeper, older part, helped build it, watched it fall, carried its ashes across the sea of time. Now that part awakens, and with it comes the final teaching, the one never spoken, only transmitted through presence. The flame is not a power, it is a vow to serve the pattern, to realign the world not through conquest, but coherence, to become a living instrument of harmony, resonating from the core of your being, to restore the sacred architecture, not just in stone, but in mind and thought and life. This is the alchemy of the new Atlantis. not a return to a place, but an emergence of, a state of being, a humanity reborn through initiation, through truth, through remembrance, and it begins with you. The watchers stir, the veil thins, the echoes converge. The flame returns, not in temples, but in hearts that remember, and you have always known.